Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thanks to you joining us on Zoom. I'm Zach Lesser. I'm one of the organizers of the seminar, along with Jerry Singerman, now retired from Penn Press, John Pollack of the Kislak Center, Eileen Malcolm, Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. We do have the sign-up sheet going around, so please do sign in. We are continuing to refine our hybrid technology. So we are going to try to let people on Zoom ask their question live viva voce tonight. Let's use that raise hand function if you have a question, and Eileen will moderate from the Zoom and call on you and unmute you. You can unmute and ask your question live. If something goes wrong, we'll revert to we'll let you know to type your questions in the chat. Also, I've been neglecting one of the usual practices that Peter had, which was to mention who's coming next week at the beginning. So I think that's a good practice. And I wanted to let you know, next week we welcome Penn's own Marge Bruchak, who will talk about a wampum belt that's in the Penn Museum, which I believe we're going to be able to have here. Yeah. No?
Okay, news to staff in the library.
She is talking about a specific object in the museum, so we'll try. But also she'll be speaking about the textuality of wampum belts more broadly. Okay, so I'm really pleased to welcome live Christina Lupton and virtually Ben Davies, who are going to speak together tonight. Christina Lupton is professor of English and comparative literature at the University of Warwick, and she is on, are you still on secondment currently?
Yes.
Secondment, a great word, at the University of Copenhagen. And we're lucky to have her here in Philadelphia for this semester. Professor Lupton works on the history of reading and 18th century British literature. She's the author of Knowing Books, The Consciousness of Mediation in 18th Century Britain, which was published by Penn Press in 2011, as well as Reading and the Making of Time, Johns Hopkins, 2018, which deals with the intersection of the Codex with new orderings of time, work, and leisure. And it was reviewed in Public Books under the title, The Book is a Time Machine, which I really like. She's long been concerned, therefore, with the time of reading, with how we make time to read, with not having enough time to read. And then the pandemic happened, and it was kind of perfect timing, and the Lockdown Reading Project was born. Now, if you Google Ben Davies Portsmouth, you get a Wikipedia article about the ex-Portsmouth footballer, current coach of Grimsby Town FC, not like a Premier League team. But that's not our Ben Davies, though maybe you're good enough to play for Grimsby Town. No, so Ben Davies is senior lecturer in English at the University of Portsmouth. He focuses on modern and contemporary literature, the history of reading, theories of reading, and gender and sexuality studies. And his first book was Sex, Time, and Space in Contemporary Fiction, Exceptional Intercourse, Palgrave, 2016. I kind of feel like you buried the lead there with the subtitle. He's also edited a volume of essays on John Burnside, published last year by Bloomsbury, and articles on Philip Roth, John Updike, Ali Smith, and others. And one outcome, if I'm understanding it correctly, one outcome of the Lockdown Reading Project is his individually planned monograph on time in the work of Ali Smith. So we're really glad that you could join us remotely, Ben, and we really hope the technology works. So now I will turn the computer back this way and join me in welcoming.
Okay, hi everyone. So thanks so much for having us, both of us here today, and for accommodating this crazy mixed mode of presentation. Ben and I are going to alternate in presenting this, which hopefully will work in this format that you've set up for us. And Ben's also going to sort of be up there on the screen looking over my shoulder as I present, making sure I say the right things in my bits. So we're really grateful that Zach and Jerry and John and Island are hosting this today, because the topic of this paper, which reports on a study that we've been doing for the last 15 months into the habits of readers under the most intense period of lockdown and quarantine in Denmark and in the UK, is not strictly about the materiality of text. Various people, Jerry and Zach, can vouch for the fact that I could have worn other hats today and been here perhaps more legitimately. But I am going to say that the question of materiality comes up both in our results and in the design of this project as an experiment in what it might mean to study the reception of books in time. We want to make time itself a key factor in understanding how books become meaningful. And so in the sense that this is a chance to sort of throw that this experiment your way, and to have people used to thinking very closely about objects interact with us around these theoretical questions of what it would mean to make a sort of more matrix-driven theoretical paradigm for thinking about their reception and circulation. We feel really privileged to be able to try it out on you guys. And we hope, although we don't have any objects to display or even any PowerPoints, because we decided Ben's face was more important than the PowerPoints, we do, I think, have enough that in this forum we can, at the end, talk about some of the sort of material implications, or the implications for thinking about materiality of the paradigm shift that we've been trying to make with this project. So
just check you can hear me. Tina, you can give me the thumbs down if not. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so just to reiterate, thanks for having me virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but maybe after November. So this project began in that what now seems like a long ago moment of spring last year, and when the very first weeks of the pandemic were associated with the promise of time to read. So from the very start of the lockdown periods across the world, commentators speculated on this being an ideal moment for settling down with books and novels and literature. So on the 23rd of March 2020, for instance, Refinery 29 offered a list of impressively long novels, including Anna Karenina, Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, and the Outlander series. And they asked the question that we might have had in our own minds: when will you have a chance to work through these behemoths other than now? On the 20th of April 2020, The Times in Britain ran a piece titled "The Best Long Books to Read During Lockdown, What? Only 800 Pages." And its tagline was, "So you finally got enough time to get through a weighty classic." And you see this sort of commentary with academics and writers buying into this lockdown logic. The scholarly V21 collective, for instance, started an online lockdown close reading of Henry James' The Wings of the Dove and The Ambassadors, declaring that War and Peace is a perfect book to read together for the duration of our necessary isolation. The writer Yuan Li started #TolstoyTogether, which was a collective Instagram and Twitter read of the novel. In June 2020, David Denby published his account of rereading Crime and Punishment in an online class at Columbia in the New Yorker. And in November 2020, Oliver Munday wrote about his reading of Proust during the pandemic. And so these early promises and idealized scenarios of pandemic reading prompted our study, which began in response to these assumptions that fiction would burgeon under these new conditions of social isolation, furlough, and quarantine. So how, we wanted to know, would the reality of lockdown reading measure up to such predictions of novels and books as somehow being ideally suited to being read under these new conditions? Surely we wondered, as I'm sure you all did when you looked at your own workloads and the ever-growing Zoom meetings, not everyone would have time to read like this. Also, wasn't the news more interesting, if not scary, and the HBO series perhaps more likely to capture the reader's attention than the novel? But there was, of course, for us, the tantalizing possibility that something was happening to reading, about the dying down of other kinds of activity, and perhaps the dialing up of existential questions about human existence. And these perhaps were bringing bookish activity to the fore. Certainly as the first reports came in of spring 2020 book sales, it did seem that people were at least buying books and more books. But how exactly, we wondered, were we, let alone historians of the future, to interpret that spike in loans and book sales?
So by the time we'd secured funding, which has gone on a podcast assistant we had for the first year of the project, and transcription, as well as a postdoc, it was late in the summer of 2020. Both Ben and I came to this moment equipped to think about reading in relation to temporality. So Ben, as you've heard, had written on time in contemporary literature, and I'd written about 18th century book use in relation to time. So both of us had done a lot of thinking about codex as an interface with time, and about fiction as something that interfaces with time more generally. But we were novices at qualitative research. Our first task then was to figure out how to reach readers, especially under lockdown conditions, and what to ask them. In the end, we decided, largely out of necessity, to use existing platforms. We used Facebook groups, library listservs, Twitter. Ben advertised the survey on UK radio, and we reached out in Denmark to library book clubs to distribute the initial survey, which went out in September 2020 in Denmark and the UK. Later in the fall, a little embarrassingly, and we will talk about this if you insist, but we are very embarrassed, we signed on as literary consultants for the Duchess of Cornwall's new Instagram reading club, and were able in that deal to broker a deal where we would get the metadata from that project. And we also used that platform to reach more readers, especially readers of the kind that we couldn't have hoped to reach socially. More concretely, as the results of our initial surveys came in, it meant confronting, we realized that what we'd done is set up a construction that meant confronting what people in the book industry already know, which is that the people who buy novels and the people who read them are mostly white women. So that wasn't news to any of the people in the industry we were talking about. But as literary academics, we were, of course, a little chastened, because when we think about many of these kind of hands-on reading projects like Rita Felsky's work or Martha Nussbaum's work, we aren't necessarily confronting the gender or the whiteness question in quite the way that we suddenly were. So this was a fairly sobering moment for us. But we're happy to talk about it. In the end, what we got were about answers to about 800 fairly extensive surveys. And of those 800 answers, we interviewed about 80 of these people in sort of hour-long interviews. Overall, about 75 of our respondents were female, and 95% of them were white. So we can talk more in the Q&A about the sociological makeup of the group, but for now, let us give our initial thoughts on what this method of selecting participants has meant. For in establishing that this was going to be a study of self-identified readers and their reading habits in 2020, we allowed ourselves to focus methodologically on time as the thing that we were interested in. Rather than studying a certain group or the reception of a certain kind of book or genre, we were ring-fencing a certain historical period, from mid-2020 to early 2021, as the primary object of our investigation. Lockdown reading was from the outset a different kind of study in this sense from, say, reading the Romance, Janet Radway's seminal study of middle-class women in one town reading one kind of genre, or Elizabeth Long's book clubs, Women and the Uses of Reading in Everyday Life, which is defined by its engagement with one socioeconomic group, or a study like Reading is My Window, Meg Sweeney's discussion of incarcerated women's reading strategies. It was also not going to be a study like Beth Bloom's study of self-help literature, or Elaine Oyong's When Fiction Feels Real, which recent accounts of certain kinds of texts and the readings and the readers that they attract. And it wasn't going to be like Martha Nussbaum's more abstract case for the moral education that comes with reading really good novels. Although our study is based on about the same number of interviews as Radway's famous study and Sweeney's study of women in prison, just under 100, we set no spatial or sociological limits on the people we talked to. We spoke to people in 2 countries from very different regions and class backgrounds with very different tastes in reading material. The one thing they had in common is that they were reading during a distinctive moment of history, one where contact with strangers and colleagues had been almost eliminated and the presence of one's own household members amplified. Despite other differences, our readers were all participating in a global crisis that had radical forms of behavioral chat that had radically changed behaviors and disrupted any sense of everyday life or obvious futurity. Routines, plans, and normal ways of occupying space were largely gone. Practically, because our corollaries applied only to this moment in time, we had shifted the object and its user to bring into focus the point at which these 2 variables intersected. Saying more about this theoretically moves us in 2 directions that have been important for our work since then, but which we only have time to introduce briefly here. One is in the direction of engagement with actor network theory, an approach known for highlighting the role that objects play in what seem like human interactions or interactions. For Bruno Latour, the walls of the classroom define just as much as a teacher or a curriculum what happens in the class, and the bump in the road directs the flow of traffic as well as any human agent. Starting with objects, his account of networks suggests, will tell us as much about society as any study of human intentions. This theory has galvanized the impulse to look at reading as an engagement with bookish objects in their most concrete guise, the paperback format, let's say, or a particular font, or the simple fact of a book being put into action at all, become, in this framework, keys to understanding the shape that reading takes as an activity and an occupation. But Latour himself has been subject to criticism for how little consideration this approach gives to the way that events and objects only happen in time. In a conversation published 25 years ago in France, we find Latour upbraided by his fellow philosopher Michael Serre for imagining networks as if they were outside time. Networks, Serre argues, leave an image that is too stable. But if you immerse it in time, this network itself is going to fluctuate, become very unstable, and bifurcate endlessly. In opposition to actor network theory, which Serre compares to a way of describing a football game as if it were only the ball that moves, Serre calls for a historical method that would account for the fact that players also move on the pitch unevenly. Their choreography, he suggests, depends on time. It cannot be easily graphed or charted unless time is a dimension of any model of the game. For historians of the book, as many of us here today are, Serre's invitation to think of the object and its network being immersed in time is a particular challenge. A book, his argument suggests, does not circulate between stationary readers. Anything we can say about its materiality must be passed through the fact that it is read more often or handled distinctly, let's say, on Sundays or during a reader's retirement or during a pandemic. The fact that a paperback has certain affordances materially must be passed by thinking about the way that those signify differently, for instance, in summer. In attending to time, we would have to note how a book means something, not just because of the way it is made or printed, but because it spends one stage of its life as a commodity or a gift, or as something taken down from a shelf because other avenues of reading have dried up. These temporal coordinates are easily overlooked by those working with actor network theory, as well as in studies that depend on sales or borrowing records, or more recently, on data about downloads and hits to digital sites. This project taught us almost immediately that sales figures and records were only going to be so helpful in answering the questions we wanted to answer. At the start of the pandemic, our very first interviews showed many people reading what came to hand or what already existed on the shelf. One woman whose son ran a second-hand store in England was supplied with books from his closed shop while sales were suspended. Others described turning, as those newspaper headlines advised them to do, to their own stockpiled collections of unread books, or rereading texts they already owned, or downloading free audio versions of Jane Austen novels from the internet. These acts of reading are amongst the many that notoriously leave no trace, but which undoubtedly increased in frequency in spring 2020 as people sealed themselves most conscientiously off into private spaces. These facts contributed to our sense that actor network theory was not really the model for what we were doing. If we wanted to think seriously about how reading was changing during the pandemic, we needed a model that would reckon not only with the way that the game's players had temporarily stopped moving and were now playing a different, we needed a model that would reckon with the way that the game's players had temporarily stopped moving and were now playing a different kind of game because of this.
The other theoretical debate in which we found ourselves tangled up had to do with the debates over critical and non-critical reading within the discipline of literary studies. So when we began this study, the decade of debate about surface reading, just reading, and non-critical reading within the US Academy was at its height in Europe. Scholars including Sharon Marcus, Stephen Best, Rita Felsky, and Elaine Oyoung, and also to some extent Leah Price, had advanced the case for taking seriously the kinds of attachment lay readers felt towards books and characters. Others, including Jonathan Kramnik and Caroline Lezak, were advocating for the particularity of critical reading being at the very heart of literature as a discipline. And our project felt as if it belonged on this spectrum of debate. But unlike Rita Felsky, who defends lay reading as a form of meaningful engagement with the world without talking to actual readers, we had hundreds of hours of interviews in which real readers told us things about what they did with books. Many of these reports complicated the idea that books were handled less critically or more straightforwardly outside the academy. Indeed, on the contrary, many of the readers who volunteered to speak to us made complex cases for what they wanted from novels under lockdown conditions, even to the point of defending some forms of allegory and non-relatability that trained literature students are normally seen to want. So again, then, we realized that timing itself was at issue here. For regular readers of dystopian fiction or romance, for instance, novels that might have featured more simply as objects of attachment or entertainment or education before March 2020 had become important vehicles for engaging with questions of history, mortality, and time itself. The argument for taking uncritical reading seriously seemed in this context to assume too easily a certain set of needs and desires being stable amongst readers. It helped little with what we were seeing, which was historical change making all the difference. Readers who had once enjoyed the fictionality of fantasy, for example, were now invested in its plausibility. And readers used to reading classics at a distance were now caught up in what seemed their extreme proximity. So the pandemic seemed to have problematized the distinction between critical and uncritical reading, often making categories like identification, distraction, and attachment, those categories uncritical reading defends, less relevant as explanations for why any particular kind of people read. And this wasn't because books or people reading them had changed, it was because the conditions under which novels were being consumed were simultaneously so old and so new. We're going to move now into a slower discussion of some of these examples. But before that, to get there, let's move back to the question we opened with, of whether people had more time to read under lockdown. Because we did get an answer to that quite quickly, and that was that readers didn't uniformly find themselves with more time. This was especially true of parents and of those who were now working online at home. Some readers we spoke to did describe longer spells of unbroken time, or the possibility of reading that came with the extraordinary stationary summer of 2020. But many readers we spoke to felt that they had less time for themselves, and certainly less undivided or uninterrupted time. The interesting thing, though, is that this did not mean they were reading less. On the contrary, it seems that the pundits of literary journalism were at least partly right, even if they were only right for the wrong reasons. Most readers were reading more, and they were reading more despite the feeling that they had less time. So one question might be, why were they reading? The chapters of the book we've ended up writing answer this in multiple ways. Readers were reading to learn about plagues in the past, or to read about their own situation at home. They read classics. They read some of those really long books that journalists predicted they'd now find time for, often as part of a challenge to themselves. They read about the outdoors. To some extent, they read to keep up with publishing events like the release of Ali Smith's Summer in summer 2020. They also read to refamiliarize themselves with bookish objects on their shelves. Some read to escape or put lockdown into some sort of perspective, and often those readers that did so often turned to reading about worse atrocities, such as that depicted in, for example, Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. Many interviewees also discussed deliberately seeking out works by Black authors in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the international BLM protests last year. Two common refrains among our interviews as to why they were reading were, one, that it allowed them to regain a sense of agency and even achievement during lockdown. It was a way of doing something and interacting, and one that wasn't screen dependent. And secondly, the completed nature of written narrative seemed to offer a counterbalance to the uncertainty created by news updates and continuous doom scrolling. So we're going now to give two examples of the work we've been doing with interviews. Tina's first going to talk about the case of people reading about pandemics, in particular Camus, and then I'll come back to talk at the end about the case of people who did read or tried to read those really long books that journalists suggested they might now have time for.
So the first case of people reading novels about pandemics of the past seems relatively easy to interpret, both in terms of sales figures and motivation. Already on March the 3rd, 2020, Edistat reported on Twitter that sales of the folio version of the French original of Camus' La Peste had spiked in the first 8 weeks of the year. In the UK, by November, sales of that novel had soared by 1,000%, while Danish sales of the translation were up 1,200% in comparison with the year before. This shows up in what several of our readers say about turning to that novel. Rebecca, for instance, describes her pleasure in Camus in these terms. It's just so similar to what's going on, but maybe a bit more extreme, she reports, because obviously that was written before technology. So, you know, reading about people trying to get letters out to their loved ones and trying to get home to their loved ones and things, it did actually make me feel fortunate that we do have technology, that we don't have to have those issues of trying to connect with our families during this time. So I did think it helped put things in perspective. This account of the novel seems justified in many ways. Camus' description of the gradual increments in which a mysterious illness takes hold of the town of Oran in Algeria, his account of the losses and separations the closing of the city gates produces, and his insight into the specific horror that the death of a family member under conditions of quarantine entailed do now seem uncannily prescient. Yet there's already something interesting about Rebecca's praise for this novel as a realistic description of events that have come to pass, which is that the plague was never written as a report on events that happened. Camus draws in his depiction of the illness that strikes Iran on another fiction of plague, Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year, and his novel was written to represent a very different kind of threat to human society. The town of Oran, stripped of all historical and geographical coordinates, we're told that this story happened sometime in the 1940s, but we learn nothing of Algeria's colonial occupation, its real coastal position, or the experience of the Arab population, stands for the many 20th century towns under military siege in World War II. The stadiums represented in the novel on the outskirts of town, the trains in which the corpses are transported, reference without directly naming the specific horrors of Nazi Germany. The spread of a virus allows Camus, like many of the authors of dystopian and fantasy fiction, to explore the idea of contagion and the conditions that call out simultaneously for new levels of care and for protective isolation. So as we began to look at the reception of The Plague in 2020, this widely acknowledged status of the novel as an allegory presented us with some interesting challenges. Is Rebecca wrong to imagine The Plague as truly informative about the past and thus our present? None of the many fictions that have helped readers make sense of the pandemic, and this is a list of just some of the novels that our readers told us they'd read this year. Lingmar's Severance, Emily St. John Mantell's Station 11, Saramago's Blindness, Liam Brown's Skin, Emma Donohue's Pull of the Stars. All of these pandemic novels none of them are as explicitly denuded of real coordinates or as urgent in their political critique of the 20th century as The Plague. But all of them use sickness and the challenges that its survivors face to address larger problems of a society at risk of self-destruction and to conjure up a vaguely defined past or a future just out of reach. To read any of them as literally as Rebecca seems to have done is at best to miss fiction's prognostic powers and at worst to misconstrue entirely the messages of human responsibility that these novels seem to carry. On the other hand, what we were seeing was no case of readers mistaking allegory for history. As Emil, a Danish fantasy reader in his 40s, put it, in a world where we walk around in masks, following directions from an institute we don't quite trust, this world seems suddenly to come from fiction. The fact that we suddenly have a pandemic, an infection, is a classic science fiction trope, says Emil. If you want to write realistic literature right now, you just have to deal with this. If you'd written it a year ago, it would have been science fiction. Kirsty, a UK librarian who spent much of 2020 furloughed, says, you see, I've never directly compared what I'm reading to my current situation. This is actually the first time I've done that. I think I've really thought about that. While she always considers her reading deeply, Kirsty goes on to explain that normally I'll be in the story and I'll think about the story and I'll think about that world and, you know, it could stay with me for ages, but I won't really put it over on my own life or like current world views. In the UK, Emily describes starting Blindness at the start of the pandemic. The experience, she admits, gripped her in a way she wasn't prepared for. I was discussing it with my partner quite a lot, which I don't necessarily always do. I would perhaps discuss something at the end, but I was like discussing it with him as I was reading it because I would think, I can't believe this. Like Kirsty, Emily is surprised by this compulsion to connect the novel she's reading to her real world experience. This is not normally how she reads, but she stumbled into a new possibility of making a connection between fiction and reality, and she finds herself relating her reading to her experience despite her own past preference for reading that rules out that vector of comparison. Fran, an English reader, notes in a similar spirit that her 2020 reading, which includes several novels with a pandemic-y kind of storyline, now strikes her in a new way. Normally, I just don't notice that they're about these things, and it's almost like the Baader-Meinhof syndrome, where you suddenly become aware of this. Her circumstances have aligned with her reading without her will. It's the prominence of history that's reclassified the fantasy fiction she's always chosen as being suddenly about the real world. As we've discussed, in the background of the study are arguments for the merits of attending to actual reading practices rather than academic ones. These disciplinary debates can make it seem as if there are choices to be made between the study of reading as an everyday practice and its cultivation as a critical and disciplinary endeavor. Yet here, the taking of the responses of real readers more seriously allows us to see where fiction's capacity to solicit investment and attachment depends upon setting and circumstance. Like many other objects of significance, books emerge in this light as mattering differently within certain constellations than in others. For the reader caught up in a global pandemic, a novel like The Plague simply reads differently than it does for the school student of French literature reading it in healthy times. Thus, the alternative ways of thinking about novels that are parceled out to one kind of reading or another in the method wars become less easily distinguished. Readers who once looked to novels only for pleasure or distraction have found themselves in 2020 relating differently to genre fiction, consuming it with a new hunger for historical perspective and sense of its true applicability to their lives. And readers accomplished in deciphering allegorical meaning have found themselves compelled to read more literally or less professionally and critically than they do under normal conditions. Here and throughout the project, specifying and understanding the way these experiences arise from a conjunction of novels with their particular temporally defined conditions of reception has been our challenge.
Turning to our second example then, as we said, lockdown was often associated with a certain type of book and a certain type of reading activity. The big weighty book and the long time-consuming read. Unsurprisingly, however, calls to read Moby Dick, War and Peace, Proust, and so on, didn't much consider the temporal conditions of reading such books. Only the idea that everyone now magically had more time to read and could therefore read a classic tome. However, as we have been able to investigate with our interviewees in detail, the very length of the book is part of the lived reading experience, not merely an abstract idea. Indeed, the long novel's length can often be a hindrance to readerly attention, especially in difficult circumstances such as a pandemic. As many of our interviewees discussed, the long read often presented existential as well as practical problems for reading during lockdown. Rebecca in England, for example, addresses the tension between readerly desire and the long read's temporal commitments, and demands, when she recalls how she didn't want to begin Ulysses in case she couldn't finish it, because, as she's put it in her own words, I think if I hadn't completed it, it would just have made me feel like a failure, and I couldn't have handled that during the lockdown. So Rebecca initially subscribes to the logic of the opportune moment. She began by thinking now is the time to finally read Ulysses, and positions reading the long, difficult classic as a challenge to overcome. However, attention to the act of reading in this instance inhibits the possibility of narrative attention. The prospect of attempting to read a long, complex novel becomes too much for her during the pandemic, as the usual distinction, as she put it, between her life and work becomes blurred. So unlike those claims about lockdown being some sort of unfettered temporal gift to readers, lockdown often exaggerated the conditions under which people live and read. Living under lockdown, Rebecca is psychologically more comfortable with not beginning Ulysses than with starting and abandoning it, which also shows how the long novel does not automatically offer some immersive form of escape or enjoyable experience. In her case, attention does not simply flow from the reader to the fictional world undivided, uninterrupted, as we see, for example, in Nussbaum's account of narrative attention. It does not even begin to flow. The attention Rebecca gives to the weight and length of the book and her life situation prohibits this particular long read. Such reading resistances also surfaced for another interviewee, Alexandra, a woman in her 40s who lives in Bournemouth in the south of England. And she was troubled by the idea of beginning Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, which was published early in 2020, explaining, I love Hilary Mantel so much, and I love this trilogy. But I looked at it and I thought, what if I die before I get to the end of this? It'll be the most unsatisfactory experience. Far from offering the experience of idealized narrative attention that is beyond paraphrase then, the very length of the third part of Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy is problematic, and problematic because of the conditions under which this reader approaches it or doesn't. During the first UK lockdown, Alexandra has an intense fear of death for herself and also a justified expectation of Cromwell's literary demise, both of which affect her ability to focus and pay readerly attention. So here we see just how, for example, as Rita Felsky writes in The Limits of Critique, the text as a co-actor in a network is something that makes a difference that makes things happen, or here indeed not happen. For critics such as Frank Kermode and Peter Brooks, the notion of the end in life and literature is especially important, loaded with significance. In Kermode's The Sense of an Ending, for instance, he pays this wonderfully attentive, sustained account of the relationship between fictive ends in literature and in life, but he does not consider the reader's experience as such, nor offer a phenomenological account of any reader being at the beginning, middle, or end. Such an absence seems particularly significant, for example, when Kermode argues that Sartre's La Nausée represents a kind of crisis in the relation between fiction and reality, the tension or dissonance between paradigmatic form and contingent reality. And his reflections ultimately remain on a sort of literary theoretical plane, whereas Alexandra's interview shows that her contingent reality shows that she can't even begin to read the 1,000-page novel because of her fear of ending in the middle. Similarly, in his account of retrospection in Reading for the Plot, Peter Brooks posits the end of narratives with significance. The end of narrative, as we know, in Brooks' formulation, is when the reader is able to reach the maximal point of retrospection they've been anticipating. A narrative may want this ultimate moment of understanding, however, but as our interviewees show, and here in particular Alexandra shows, real ends and fictive ends can often compete with, and rather than easily map onto one another. The idea of Judgment Day and death in reality negatively influences her, impeding her ability to begin, let alone finish, a long narrative. As she acknowledges, she desires ends in narrative and in life, saying, "I'm guessing that when it comes to my turn to shuffle off, I want everything tied up." But it is this desire for the end that stalls rather than drives her reading. As she says, "I couldn't bear to die and not know what happened." And of course, her lockdown framing is doubly paradoxical. She will not know what happens if she begins and does not finish the novel, nor will she know what happens if she simply does not start. Moreover, she does know what happens in a sense at the end, given the novel's historically and generically determined destination. Cromwell will die. Despite her anxiety, Alexandra is unable to find out by simply skipping ahead either. As she says, she's not one of those people that can read the last page first. So whilst we might, as Kermode argues, have our vital interest in the structure of time, in the Concord's books arranged between beginning, middle, and end, Alexandra's early lockdown fears affect her ability to reach an end. She's unable to reach the Judgment Day moment of maximal retrospection in fiction. And correlatively, she doesn't want to reach that end point, so as not to experience Cromwell's demise. Here, the very real fear she has of dying from COVID-19 was experienced as a barrier to reading itself, a fear of dying in the midst of life and in the midst of narrative. Whilst then some people may have had more time for long reads in lockdown, ultimately not even having more time necessarily equates to more reading. At odds with those enthusiastic early calls heralding lockdown as the perfect time for long reads, lockdown has been much more complex, exposing as much as offering the conditions reading requires. As Alexandra for one shows, reading does not happen in a vacuum, and lockdown was not some sort of empty time space in which to read Tolstoy. Rather, the temporal conditions of reading under lockdown complicate and enrich such notions, as well as the theoretical ideas and models as proposed by the likes of Martha Nussbaum, Kermode, and Brooks. Indeed, rather than thinking about written narrative simply as a model through which to explore time, our study has enabled us to see, under specific conditions, how the felt, lived experience of life and time affect reading, underscoring the fact that the relationship between life and reading is not simply a matter for narratological models, but a complex entanglement of multiple actors in time. Thank you.
Thank you both for that really interesting and packed talk. There's a lot in there, and the floor is open for questions. If you reminder that if you're on Zoom and you want to ask a question, please put your virtual hand up. But we'll start in the room. People want to ask. Yeah, Jerry.
Thank you for this very thoughtful reflection on the times we're living in. I think very casually, almost tossed away, was the distinction between reading and binge watching a long streamed narrative during lockdown, which is something many of us found ourselves doing, and indeed doing in a way that we quite literally never had time to do before. So I'm just wondering whether you could talk a bit more about the distinction you make between reading in lockdown and watching this new form of entertainment that is very frequently spoken of in terms analogous to, let's say, the 19th century serialized novel.
Yeah.
Can you try to just quickly summarize?
Yeah. So Ben, this is a question that we ask ourselves all the time about where what the continuities and discontinuities between the HBO long series is and reading. And I guess, I mean, I'll start off maybe just by saying that I think I think there are many arguments that one could make about the spectrum of entertainment being a continuous one these days, so that reading doesn't have, the special status that we're giving it by ring fencing it in the way that we've done in this study. However, there are some points, I think, that have to do with feelings of control and also community, where I see that people that we're talking, many of the people we're talking to belong to quite elaborate communities of readers, where there are built sort of life worlds around reading a novel, talking about a novel, being part of a library group. And I'm not talking about the academy. And I think you could make the argument for the equivalent experience around, everybody watching Mayor of Easttown or whatever it was. But I think it would look a little bit different from these more sort of semi-organized kind of reading communities that we seem to have tapped into. But then there's also, I think, some interviews where people really are quite explicit about the forms of control that they feel over narrative. A bit as Ben's last examples are suggesting, where there's something really about thinking about the timing of one's own life that has to do with the specific interface of the book as something that you can really contemplate from before you even open it, and control once you're in the midst of it in a very different way from the way that you sort of, I think you seed control really differently to the media formats of the series. But Ben, I don't know, do you want to have a shot at
Can I
this?
just add something that one of the things that came across a lot in the interviews about reading was that it's very hard to multitask when you're reading, particularly the printed written word. Whereas people felt that even if they were watching, whether it's The Sopranos for the 10th time, or whatever, it was very easy to multitask and to not have the same level of focus. So that was another technological difference that came across. And the community question also can be seen the other way as well. Often interviewees talked about watching as part of viewing parties, like on Amazon, you can do that collectively, whereas reading was largely something they seemed to be doing for themselves. Possibly some parents were using it as a way to interact with their children, but most readers saw it as a way to break away from interactions with others, and particularly interaction on another screen. So those would be some other key points, I think, that come through quite consistently there.
Yeah, we have a chapter about romance where we look at normal people, where we're looking, a lot of people talk about having watched it and read it in one order or another. So that's the chapter where we're sort of wrestling a bit with that, trying to think about. And I mean, I think that does capture also probably what is for most of us the reality, which is that we do both. And that it's silly to imagine people doing one or the other.
I also mentioned that I think sort of distinguishes that you mentioned a sense of achievement that comes with the long books. And I think, you know, there's something like, there was this whole language of like, what can you learn, you know, new? Some people are taking up piano, some people are the sourdough, you know, baking. And I think reading a book, right,
Yeah.
there is kind of moral improvement
Yeah.
narrative that surrounds the reading of a class, certainly of the long classics, that doesn't really obtain with watching an HBO,
Yes.
watching an HBO series. Right? For Jerry, it does. But,
I mean, I felt that when I binge watched the, I don't know, the 6 seasons of The Americans, right, which I was able to do.
You thought it was like Anna Karenina. It was like Anna Karenina.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was also gaining a certain kind of cultural literacy that I have not had for the past decade or so that everybody else has been watching that show. And the temporality of screening something when it's all there, right? You can watch all 6 seasons at your own pace. You can stop in the middle of an episode when you want to and start it up again. Is something much more like reading than the experience of, I mentioned Mayor of Easttown, or The White Lotus, right? HBO was releasing those episodes, 10 o'clock on Sunday night, and so you were beholden to the broadcaster, and I do see that as a very different kind of experience in time, and something where I have much less control, right? Whereas if I want to sit down and I want to watch The Wire, right?
Yeah.
That much different than saying I want to read Remembrance of Things Past. I don't know.
Well, I mean, but reading too breaks down into those 2 kinds of reading, right? And again, for most of us, we do both kinds of reading. So most of our readers pick up, the Jane Eyre, which they haven't read for years, but they also read hot off the press, whatever the latest Ali Smith novel is, because everyone else is reading it. So I think I think the examples of the different kinds of viewing also fit into the different kinds of reading that we saw people doing.
I still think there's something different about time, about Remembrance of Things Past, and even Prestige TV.
Yeah.
The idea that you were going to use this time in a good way. I don't think The Wire even quite get, maybe The Wire's close, right?
Yeah.
Really prestigious TV, but that you used your time wisely.
Can we turn this into a question? That point about, is this, I think that I agree with that, because moral improvement, the sort of tone of the commentator saying, here's what we all should do. Are you sensing that in your surveys? Do people feel moral pressure to?
Yeah, we have some questions that relate to that. And we did, I think, Ben, just jump in if you think I'm saying this wrong, but I think we did begin maybe a little more Bourdieuian than we ended up, maybe with the hypothesis that people were going to do this kind of, challenge, that this was going to be an aspect of people's pandemic reading. But at least amongst the people that we talked to, I would say we have at least as many people describing their reading of classics as a kind of like, oh, I began thinking I should, but then I kept going because I realized what the hell, the world was ending, and I'm just going to actually read the classics that I liked. And by the end, I was doing it because I loved it. So there's some pretty heartwarming sort of conversion stories there, I would say. Yeah. It's like, and obviously, and my sense amongst our readers is that the people who were motivated by sort of prestige and achievement, that we have a few, like obviously really crazily sort of motivated people who sort of organize their whole year as a kind of reading program for themselves and had seasonal reading, decide they were going to read, you know, only French literature in the spring, and then they were going to read. But mostly the people who had these kind of ambitions seem to have given up and been more inclined to say, you know, I realized that this was the time to do stuff that was meaningful for myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a strong element of beginning to feeling pressured at the beginning, but then actually deciding that time was too short, which is also something they were sort of feeling or buying into, that idea as well. Yeah, definitely.
Sure, and then let's go to Hudson, and then let's go to Jim.
I was just thinking about this idea, Tina, that that pandemic time changes the reasons why people read, and kind of shakes the snowball instead of the distinction we would have been making in kind of critical critique between lay readers and professional readers or academic readers. And I wonder if you could also look at that from the other way around and think about academic readers who started reading more like lay readers. I definitely felt that. You know, I was in a reading group where we read Daniel Defoe's Plague Year, and instead of reading it for, like, you know, what I could pull out of it to teach my students, or I was reading it to find out what was going on in my life, you know.
Yeah.
I had to explain the news.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Rebecca, the one I was talking about reading Camus too, literally isn't an academic, but I think there's a lot of people, I mean, that would be obviously the flip side of the point that I was making with that case, which is that, you know, you think you know how to read allegorically, or you think you know how to read as a reader of fantasy, sort of genre fiction about plague, but actually you can shift camps quite quickly if the temporal conditions of reading change. So yeah, I think that's very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is such a wonderful talk. I actually have a question about the other part of the long books, but the sort of play reading. Just thinking about Journal of a Plague Year and Severance, they both have such intense imagery around plagues. Defoe is kind of the space in the air becomes alive, and in Severance you have, you know, people who are sick still walking, sort of bodies within the book. And I was wondering if you had anyone talking about turning to plague fictions, not to historically relate to it, but because of sort of like how devoid our early lockdown was of imagery. I'm just thinking about how, like, in March 2020, I mostly just saw my apartment walls and maybe Instagram about sourdoughs, but I had no like imagery of COVID-19. Maybe it's because I don't watch a lot of news TV, but
yeah,
it felt like a very almost like imagery less or light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this question is about whether we spoke to people who were using sort of the densely descriptive kind of plague fictions to fill in the blanks in those early months of pandemic experience, where the sort of sterility of life didn't give those textures. We weren't seeing what was going on in the NHS wards or the I mean, I feel as if for myself, I feel as if I've got more evidence of the fact that people who do read anyway, and I have to say, generally, I've been very humbled by this project. I mean, I really used to think of my students and my colleagues as the best readers out there. And now I realize that in every little Danish provincial town, there's someone who reads, 600 books a year. So I guess I think of the people who are really extreme readers as being just probably people who were able to furnish their worlds very densely with sort of images of history, images of disease, images of horror that are provided by just this kind of constant immersion in textual worlds. But I don't know, Ben, can you remember anyone who was talking about pandemic-y novels like that?
I didn't quite hear the question, I have to say, but was it about texture?
Yeah, about whether anyone was using it to sort of provide the texture that the early news wasn't when it came to
Yeah,
COVID.
there's a clear, I can't remember the person's name, but they definitely said that reading literature was giving them what facts and numbers weren't in the news. So that was definitely a way of novels providing some sort of narrative world beyond number magic that we got a lot of in the UK from the government and that sort of thing. So definitely they were doing that. That was a strong example.
Yeah.
It also became the texture of their own world in the sense that a lot of interviewees talking about literature became the thing they did with other people, because they didn't have much to talk about as lockdown went on about what they did that day, because most of it was sitting at home. So a lot of them they actually would phone up people and talk to them about whatever novel they'd been reading. So I thought that was quite interesting as well, becoming a sort of topic of conversation under these conditions, which perhaps they were suggesting it hadn't been previously for them.
Jim, can you unmute and show us your face?
I can do that. Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Tina and Ben, for this. It's just so interesting. And I mean, we so rarely in literary studies really have an opportunity to hear about and think about and discuss this kind of data, this kind of information about actual readers and what they say about their reading. I'm wondering about the sort of broad question of we could call the problem of self-reporting, the biases and inaccuracies and kind of observable tendencies of people when they're asked to narrate or describe an experience. And so, I mean, I feel like some of this has already come up in some of the, as Tina was saying, like heartwarming stories that you hear, or someone said classroom kind of, there's a set of genres or tropes that we've all internalized that we know that are kind of expected when someone says to us, like, what have you learned from your reading, or how can you describe your experience of reading during the pandemic, especially where you're putting a certain pressure on it. But this is a problem that I think anyone wrestles with who is studying readers and reading, or even just consumption. We found in our own work on readers in Goodreads that a lot of readers describe their reading as very eclectic. They say, like, any kind of book, I read all kinds of genres. They'll do lists of genres and everything. But when we look at the books that they've actually read according to their shelving on Goodreads, it can in many cases be very, very narrow. It's not at all eclectic. But there's a kind of expectation or a value of eclecticism that kind of trumps what appears to be the empirical reality of their reading. Or like an extreme case of this question, I think, is a work like Rita Felsky's Hooked, where her kind of case studies, her readers are 90% of them are professional writers working in the genre of, like, the essay on how I came to appreciate so-and-so, or the sort of essay about their reading or their relationship to a particular work of art or particular artist. And so there really is a genre, and they have to work up an interesting story in order to make it a saleable essay or whatever. So I'm just wondering whether you've thought about that, or how you guys have maybe taken that on board in considering what you're getting back from these readers about their reading.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something we thought about from the beginning when we were designing the project. This idea of a feedback loop, and one that we might add to that as well. That was another consideration. How are we not doing that? So I guess one pragmatic response, or answer, which isn't necessarily, it's not foolproof, but during the interviews, it's about listening to what people have said, and your case about if they say they've read widely, then you ask them what they've read. And then you see whether it is wide or narrow or whatever. It's a question of probing. And I don't want that to sound like the interviews were sort of interrogations, but you start off with an open sort of conversation, and you have a rapport, and then you start to actually probing what they mean when they respond by saying, you know, whether this, as you example, you know, that this has got me through lockdown. You sort of ask what they mean by that and what else have they been doing. And it's a question of, I think, just responding and interrogating, which you can do with real readers, which you can't do like, because Rita Felsky in Hook, they're all from written
That's right.
reviews, yeah, on Amazon. So she can't, as far as I'm aware, she can't really have that to and fro. And there have been cases where we've gone back to readers and emailed them and asked for follow-up sort of responses. So I think that's my practical answer to that question. I don't know, Tina, if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, I mean, Jim, I've been very interested reading your work on Goodreads and trying to work out where this is aligned with that and where it's different, right? And how the reporting that we're getting, it has been different from, I mean, many of the people we've spoken to are also potentially writers on Goodreads, I think. So, but I would say en masse, our interviews include quite a lot of instances where people are saying, I hated this, or I didn't do this, or I didn't finish it. I thought I would start it and then I didn't. I mean, there's quite a lot of negative reporting. So we're not looking simply at people, and there's quite a lot of reported failure as well, I think, or yeah. So it's
Never finished it.
Yeah.
No, I do think the interview is like the gold standard in a way, you know, as opposed to the survey, you know, or the scraped data from social media. There's no feedback. And our project initially involved this wing, this set of researchers who were going to do interviews with a whole set of Goodreads users. But for various reasons, practical and legal, that couldn't actually happen.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
But that's why, I mean, another reason that the stuff that you've got is just so rich and so rare.
Could I just follow up with can you tell us a little more about the interviews themselves? Was there 10 questions you wrote, or what were the questions?
No, the interviews are very organic. So the interviews make good reading. So in fact, John, this might be a question to ask back to you. So we're sort of actually quite interested. When we applied for money, we got this funded by Carlsberg Foundation. So it's funded by Denmark's biggest beer company. And our pitch for this was that we were going to basically contribute to the historical archive. And we didn't even say that we were going to write a book. We said we were going to produce these interviews and that they were going to sit somewhere. And so since then, we found them so interesting that we started writing this book. But the archival question remains for us, which is, so where should these interviews sit? And in what form? Should they sit somewhere as something people can listen to? We've had a lot of them transcribed. Should they sit somewhere as transcriptions? Should they be online? Like, because actually I do think, I mean, there's so much stuff in those interviews that just comes up because they're these conversations that people are having during a time when conversation is quite rare. And some of them are just quite, I think, quite fascinating conversations.
The other thing just to add is that almost all of them are recorded via Zoom, because we had to do them via Zoom because we couldn't travel or meet up with people. So there's a video archive potentially as well, which I think is also interesting. Yeah.
Sarah Wasserman, do you want to unmute? And Sarah will be speaking to this group on November 15th, by the way.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. I love this. And I just want to say one thing that I especially appreciate is that you do, regardless of whether we're post-critical or any of that, you know, that you're doing this in such good faith. And that makes it really, I don't know, different and interesting and pleasurable to listen to. But I have a question about something you sort of opened with when you were talking about people now read Severance or they read The Plague and they read it in a different mode. They read it as realism or something like that. And it struck me because it just strikes me that it's about relatability, right? And I'm sure maybe you know this amazing essay by Brian Glavy in PMLA about relatability being this paradigmatic mode of cultural absorption now, especially maybe for a certain generation, but kind of across the board. And so it made me want to ask you if there's a way, if you've thought at all about how much of that kind of response when people say, oh, I would have thought this was not like my life, but now it is symptomatic of maybe a broader trend of relatability, and how much of it feels specific to the pandemic. And is there a way, I don't know if that's even a question that interests you, but if it is, like, how do you get at that distinction?
Well, that's a
Well,
great question. Yeah.
It's a great question. I would say, I mean, the relatability stuff, I did read that essay. I don't remember all of it. But I mean, relatability doesn't quite capture what we would generally be seeing with people reading, you know, Severance or Mantel, or what's the one I really like called the Emily's Station 11. That's
Station
what
11, yeah.
Yeah, we had to read all these to catch up with our readers, but so I don't think those are the kind of novels that are generally seen as part of the new generation of relatability novels. That argument is about something else. So what we're talking about with these novels are novels that wouldn't generally tick the relatability box, because they would generally be in a more genre fiction sort of fantasy box. And then they've turned into sort of potential relatability material because of what's happened. So I don't know. I mean, that's not an answer. That's just me sort of thinking aloud to start it off. But that relatability stuff, which we all know as teachers of literature, is generally about something else. I think a different kind of life writing that has become so dominant, where we have a chapter as well on these sort of very popular kind of auto-fictions and fictions about domestic life. And why would you possibly read Knausgård this year of all things that, you know, you might, I mean, what does it mean to have decided this was the year we're going to read Knausgård? And we do have cases of people doing that, but that produces, I think, a different kind of argument. But normally these people aren't reading. You're not normally reading Severance for relatability. You're normally reading it for escape, right? Of some kind, I think. But Ben, do you want to?
Well, I was going to ask Sarah maybe because I don't know if you have a suggestion about that word relatability, or I was thinking about Felske's sort of different types of identification, and you know, our readers go through those in different ways, but they're still, I don't think that is what you're getting at. I think you're.
I guess it really depends. I mean, Tina's answer was clarifying because it depends on how you define relatability in part. But I think if we're talking about the broadest, maybe it's overly simple as a definition, but it's about me.
Yeah.
You know, what you're saying is people pick up a novel thinking it's going to be one thing, and then because of the pandemic find out, in fact, it is relatable. It is about me, which is sort of an interesting, like, it's part of the machinery or the juggernaut that is relatability, as opposed to, and that's a question, like, I don't actually know that that's true. You're the ones doing the interview. Yeah. As opposed to, it's not relatability, it's actually an accurate diagnostic of the world, if not of me. Mm-hmm. And that might be a distinction where then, you know, what you're saying, Tina, like, it's not really that kind of relatability, makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's a good distinction, but sorry, I think that's the distinction between relatability about me and about the world. That comes across a lot in a lot of the interviews. Particularly, I mentioned the sort of Grossman Life and Fate reading. That those people aren't thinking it's about me. They're seeing parallels or points of reference, I guess, that they can relate to.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this talk. I was interested in the part of this really timely research where you're talking about how people were interested in books as alternatives to screens. a really personal place. I find I'm more drawn to physical books now because they are less painful for my eyes. I find paper easier on my eyes. I find them physically much more pleasing to interact with after a year of being forced to interact almost exclusively on a screen. And so I'm interested if this came up in just thinking about material text. Was there something about like the physical interfacing of a book that became very appealing, like the smells, the sounds of the pages, like the way that it grounded people? It feels like that might be the case, but I'm sure you have much better.
Well, so this is a question about physicality and formats and whether we have evidence that people were drawn to the papery page as a kind of pleasing experience. I would say that it seems to me we have to throw that into the larger mix, which would, to be honest, have to also include a lot of accounting for audio books. And that, again, that surprised us, or didn't surprise us, but it took us a little bit by surprise, because of course, many people describe themselves listening to books while watching the kids playing in the garden, listening to books while they're making dinner, listening to books while they're on their bicycle, all this listening stuff. So I think it would have to be, one of the things that I was really interested in when we started, the first chapter we wrote was about this reading classics, and we had a lot of interviews where people said that they read these sort of classics because they had them physically on hand. And that was really interesting to me, that, because of course, technically speaking, we have every book we could possibly want physically on hand, if you count the ability to call it up on your Kindle or your, it's not that you don't need to have Jane Eyre on your shelf in order to access Jane Eyre. But something about the accidental, the idea that books were these things that you could run into and pick up. There was something about that I really liked. And obviously also people felt that about the old ice cream maker that you found in your cupboard that you'd never used, but suddenly this was the time to do it or whatever. But I liked books. There was a lot of stuff about books in that way, which wasn't explicitly about their physical pleasingness, but just about the fact that they sort of had a way of being in your way as physical objects that they didn't online. But I would also say that just there really was a lot of evidence that people have a way of using audiobooks and using that as well as reading books. But so for me, the format question really included that.
I think a couple of things there. One is that a lot of people did talk about the physicality of actual printed books, of particularly if they're going back to books they'd read previously, and a lot of rereading of childhood books or books read in teenage years, people going back to their favorite or their only edition. But the other thing to mention about the actual format, and this is something Leah Price is working on, early in the pandemic, there was a fear of buying new books because of the idea that the virus could be spread through touch. So a lot of people were rereading books and not buying new books, or they were ordering new books but leaving them in the garage or a bucket for 48 hours. So the materiality of books in that sense cuts both ways, I think, particularly at the beginning of lockdown.
I have a question about book groups and about your interviewees and whether any of them belong to book groups, what happened, how did that affect their reading? Because I think, I'm just thinking about, I know lots of them met on Zoom, but presumably reading books, and I didn't get a sense from what you were talking about that would come up, but maybe it did.
Yeah, book groups, Ben, what happened to book groups during lockdown? So definitely it comes up. We didn't set out to investigate it, but it's all over the place in terms of the interviews.
Well, a lot of them quite quickly moved on to online platforms in some way. So they did keep that sense of the book group going. What was interesting, I think, with a lot of older readers, the book group, like physically meeting up with people in a book group was something they lived for almost before the pandemic, and they found that move online, it was a substitute, but it wasn't the same way, particularly if they're living on their own during the pandemic and didn't really see anyone else. But the other thing that came across strongly was this sense of democratization of culture through online, whether it was just book groups, or a lot of people talked about going to book festivals online, which they'd never or wouldn't be able to go to pre-pandemic because of the costs involved in travel and tickets and so on and so forth. So that was important. But I think what was interesting in the interviews, a lot of book groups, as soon as they could, sort of in the summer of 2020, did meet back in person. So that suggested that there is something about actually meeting up with other people, which they did outside when they could, rather than being on Zoom again.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, I would say you guys are the sort of living example of all of the different permutations that a group can go through under these conditions. I think that a lot of groups around the world have been doing all of this.
Was there a sense that what book groups were reading was any different?
Did book groups change what they were reading?
Well, yeah, some of them deliberately tried to read things that seemed topical or somehow pandemic related. There were quite a lot of reports of people reading less in the book groups or not keeping up as they would have done in person, or people just not turning up online. That came across quite a lot as well. So as I said, when people were able to meet up again back in the summer of 2020, they did, but a lot of people left the online version. So I think there was sometimes sort of complications there, or just people not really liking that format, because it was yet another thing on screen.
It was one instance when the person who, I don't know if she was being totally serious, but was afraid to start the book in case she died in the middle. And
I think she was being serious, wasn't she, Ben? The
Hilary Mantel.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's deadly. Oh, I was going to say deadly serious. I didn't mean that, but she was serious. Yeah.
But I mean, but that did, I found it very hard to read because of anxiety. Like, did you get with the relationship between kind of psychological state and the particular type of attention that's needed for reading a novel, as compared, kind of very easy to watch TV. I mean, I always find it very easy to watch TV. I remember talking to a lot of people about the difference between watching TV. All I can take, even like I can't even watch a movie. I just can watch a show, like 30 minutes. So the attention span in relation to the pandemic, in relation to quarantine, and in relation to just the kind of existential anxiety that we were experiencing. Did that come?
Yeah, the anxiety, were the cases where anxiety, yes, there were definitely cases where people reported that they were too anxious to read properly. But then again, but one thing I would say, as just generally, again, as in my sort of optimistic mode about all of this, is that we are anyway not the best readers. We're not the truly addicted readers. We do this for a job. Out there in the world, there are really people who are so addicted to this medium that they do this continually. I mean, I just don't feel, I'm not even in that league. I mean, I can easily be distracted from a book that I've started by a television show or a thing I need to do. Whereas there are some pretty, I mean, and as we said, I mean, I think it's clear that we were talking to people who already self-identified as kind of committed and compulsive even readers. So for them, this medium is anyway not a stretch as a form of entertainment. It's the thing that they've chosen as their sort of primary form of pleasure and identity, I think.
Yeah, and just to add though, one thing you do, because one of the benefits of doing interviews throughout the pandemic, we were able to get a sense of how people read at different stages. And you do get with interviewees a sense, you can track sort of their attention spans. So they might have started off with great ideals and, you know, an ability to read for long stretches, but then a particularly bad period for a lot of people was the winter, 2020-21. And a lot of people said they couldn't read because, you know, it was dark, it was bleak. They thought the pandemic would be over. So we have been able to track that sort of what seasonal change or pandemic change. And obviously different for different people, but that's quite interesting as to what the causes of that are and how that changes throughout the year. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, would you go so far as to say that your respondents fall in, I mean, you're kind of inventing an interesting category. You said addicted readers, I think you used extreme readers.
Do our respondents fall into a category, an 18th century category of addicted readers?
And, and then I
Well,
was.
yeah. But
ask,
sorry.
Can you give us some speculations about those of us who want to talk about reading historically might use what you're thinking about now? Just go out on a limb, what the hell?
Okay, well, okay, Ben, I'm going to give you the addicted readers question and I'll have a go at the historical one because, I mean, you know, this is very continuous with questions that I've had about historical reading, like what does it, you know, I mean, for a long time, I was quite obsessed with the question of Sunday reading and the idea that one text could mean something very different on a Sunday from what it meant on a Monday because of the different ways that it was sort of processed through time in the 18th century week. So, I mean, these are ideas that I've been thinking about in a historical context for a long time. So for me, the point is that if you are going to have a conversation, which I think we should do, about what a text means, you know, in terms of its content, but also how that content is articulated in relation to its format and its form and its physicality, then I think you should also add time to that set of considerations, because I think the sort of set of factors is incomplete if you leave time out of the equation. I don't think just thinking about text in space is sufficient for these very concrete sort of reasons that have to do with, for instance, the fact that people for a long time read not just very different texts on Sunday, but read very differently on Sunday because reading was a very different kind of activity on Sunday from the rest of the week. So for me, this sort of chance to be in the contemporary has been a sort of break in my own work as a historian of reading. But it's very much on I mean, for me, these historical questions about how we treat objects and think of them it is historical. But then
What was the other part of the question?
What do we do with this? Are our readers, are they sort of addicts? Are they these kind of special kind of addicted readers, as we would have thought of people, you know? Are they like?
Well, yeah, okay. So the immediate person who springs to mind, I call him Spreadsheet Man, who on New Year's Day every year, he sits down and writes his spreadsheet of all the books he planned to read and all the books he did read. And we're talking in a year of about 500, 600 plus. They may not all be novels, but so that there's a sort of numerical addiction, I would say.
Sarah says, "Oh, you
yeah.
interviewed my father."
Well, if he lives in England, maybe. And then you get people, you also get the addicts who, I guess, who are completionists. They like, you know, they've read one Ali Smith, they'll read them all. But we, yeah.
Paperback because they have to match in the
Yeah.
set. And also the fit, well, we were very interested in physical space. So one of the questions that we asked people is, where did you read? And Amanda and Johanna, who were working with us on this project, for a while, it was possible to go out and interview people in person between two of the lockdowns. So some of the Danish interviews were done in person, and Johanna and Amanda took a car and drove into deep Jylland, into some crazy guy's house, which I mean, in retrospect, it's like, I can't believe we let them do this, because he was some crazy like science fiction collector who had a room full of science fiction books, and he only read in this room in a particular chair and with all his books around him. And he was some crazy guy, right? So there was some crazy addict types in there for sure.
And I just saw Jim's point in the chat, which a lot of people did mention Goodreads, particularly challenges. So that was something else which they would quantify. There were definitely the counters, you know, the people who are into the quantitative numbers aspects. And then there's the spreadsheet man, and then the sci-fi guy. So yeah, there are different types of that. Yeah.
There was one addicted reader on here for a while, but he hasn't been, I think he left early, Dan Traster.
Yeah.
Oh, Dan Traster, yeah.
Dan Traster
Well,
was
he's a
definitely what we would call,
buyer.
not for numbers, but just for quantity.
Yeah.
Sheer quantity and recommendation.
Yeah.
Well, we're approaching 7, so I think we should thank, and I can't even tell what time we're approaching midnight.
Ben has to go to bed.
Thank you both very much. This was
It's been great. Thank you.